So what we have here in figure 2.4, we have the differences between rural and urban climates. So as you can see immediately, a couple of key factors that we need to point out over here. A, let's quickly identify A. A is definitely our rural area. Okay, why do I identify A as the rural area? First of all, we can see cultivated land. Okay, and we know, if you look at rural areas, if you look at the definition of rural areas, it's usually areas that focus mainly on primary activities, okay, such as fishing, farming, forestry, or mining. Okay, so beautifully it's indicated over here, we can see it's a rural settlement, and we can even go as far to identify it as an isolated farmstead. Okay, and we can see the cultivated land, and you can see there's a lot of vegetation. Besides for the crops, you can see the trees as well, and pay attention to the temperature. Okay, 22 degrees Celsius, that's been mentioned on our figure 2.4. Another thing I want you to pay attention to the cloud cover. Okay, so it might pop into the questions. And on our right-hand side, B represents, it's quite easy, the urban area. Okay, how can we define an urban area? Urban areas usually we find secondary and tertiary activities. Okay, it's usually mainly cities. Okay, we have different classifications of urban areas. A town is the smallest example of urban areas. But for instance, as you can see in the image, we look at cities. Okay, we got high-rise buildings. Okay, and we can even go a little bit further like I did with the rural areas. We can identify figure B as the CBD. And very importantly, pay attention to the temperature that's been given to us, 32 degrees Celsius. Now, as you can see, there is roughly between the two of them 10 degrees Celsius difference. So if we just look at the diagram, the information that's being given to us, not diagram, the photos, is that the urban area is 10 degrees warmer than the rural areas. Okay, and there's a number of factors that plays a role to it. Now, before I'm going to go look at the questions, let's just quickly discuss it. Okay, why do you think that urban areas experience warmer temperatures than rural areas? Now, first of all, I'm going to draw a table, and we're just going to differentiate. We're going to label it. Okay, there's our rural areas, and we have our urban areas. Now, first of all, our first point, there's more vegetation in rural areas. Okay, when I talk about vegetation, I'm talking about trees and plants. Okay, vegetation has a cooling effect. Okay, so because of transpiration taking place, especially Kathy was here earlier on with life science. If you're a life science student, you will know about transpiration. Okay, it's when evaporation takes place, when water vapor turns into, when a liquid turns into a gas, water vapor. So plants release water vapor as well, and that's known as transpiration. So it has a much cooler effect than just artificial surfaces, and that's my next point I want to make with urban areas. It's artificial surfaces we look at concrete, we look at glass, and we look at tar road surfaces. Okay, so in the rural areas, climate is much cooler. Simple reason why is because it's covered with vegetation. Okay, if you look at your urban areas, unfortunately, what do these artificial surfaces do? They absorb the heat, okay, creating, instead of just releasing the heat, they absorb it, creating warmer conditions. Okay, another reason why, because of the vegetation, it promotes infiltration. Okay, because it's covered with vegetation, it promotes the water to rather infiltrate below the surface. Okay, now unfortunately in our city areas, if it does rain, what happens with the majority of the water? It runs off because the water can't infiltrate. The surfaces are impermeable. Okay, the water can't go through the tar road surfaces, so it runs off into our drainage systems or sewage systems, so the water gets lost. But when it rains in rural areas, the water still, it infiltrates, promotes infiltration, but the water have time to infiltrate, so also have a cooling effect. Okay, another reason that we can mention, there's more open water surfaces. For instance, dams and rivers. And in urban areas, there's less of them. Okay, so it means, anyway, if you go down to the coast or you go next to the Vaal River, for instance, you will find the temperatures are much cooler than areas further away from water. So the water creates a cooling effect. Okay, it's almost like land and sea breezes that you've done in grade 10. So the water plays a very important role. So many rural areas do find themselves to open water. Might it be lakes, might it be rivers, and might it even be the ocean. Okay, depending what type of primary activity is taking place. But if you look at urban areas, rightly so, less open water surfaces. Okay, and lastly what we can mention, less congestion or human activities. Okay, and I just want to write there on the urban areas, more congestion, pollution. Okay, now the increasing of the temperature in urban areas goes hand in hand with human activities. Now, what do we do? Now, if we look at our diagram, like we've mentioned, the photos. Now, as you can see, this is an isolated farmstead. Okay, not much is happening over there, mainly farming taking place. But if you look at the CBD, the high, tall buildings, there's many secondary activities taking place. We even do, what do we find? We find light industries. If you look at the traffic congestion in our CBD areas, it's much higher. Think of the human activities that's taking place. Congestion creates pollution. Carbon dioxide that's being released, creating warmer conditions. Okay, people use artificial heating, for instance, air conditioning, to cool themselves down or to warm themselves up. We have light industries creating open fires, right, to be able to produce goods, for instance, a bakery. Now, all of these factors, all of these activities, human activities, contribute to higher temperatures. Okay, so there's less activities taking place in our rural settlements that creates less pollution, but otherwise less heat that's being generated. Now, whatever we do, for instance, demanding by manufacturing products, we create more heat. With the heat, we create more pollution. Okay, so these are the factors that contribute to warmer temperatures in urban areas than in rural areas. But let's just quickly have a look at the questions that's being asked. Now, 2.4.1, the question states, will A or B generally experience lower wind speeds? Now, as you can see, if you look at B, it's covered with high-rise buildings, known as the CBD. Now, these high-rise buildings will create friction, okay? If you look at rural areas, you can see it's quite flat areas, not many build-up areas. Now, just imagine wind blowing, right? These tall high-rise buildings are going to create friction. So the wind speeds will be exceeding in the rural areas because it's a much more open space. So the correct answer for 2.4.1, B will experience lower wind speeds. Why? Because friction is created by the tall buildings. Okay, if you have a look at question 2.4.2, what evidence in the photograph indicates that A experienced higher evaporation rates than B? Now, I've mentioned this, we had to pay attention. Look at the cloud cover. Okay, now, for the formation of clouds, what do we need to happen? We need to experience evaporation. Excuse me. So, evaporation needs to take place. It's when the surface warms up, there's condensation taking place, evaporation takes place, right? Water vapor content, it rises, it cools, and we got the formation of clouds. So definitely we're going to experience more evaporation in our rural areas. You can see the cloud cover. So there's more evaporation taking place. Now what's the reason for it? Why do you think there's more evaporation? And I'm just going to underline what I've mentioned over there. There's more vegetation cover. There's trees because of evapotranspiration. I've explained that a little bit earlier. There's more open water surfaces such as dams and rivers. So that creates the opportunity for more cloud formation taking place in our rural area. Now, if you look at our urban areas, for example, we have less cloud cover over here. The simple reason because we experience much drier let me put it this way. We experience rather a drier air content. Okay, the reason for it is because of the amount of pollution that's created and because it's artificial. We don't have that much trees, we don't have that much vegetation, and we don't have that much water surfaces that can create evaporation for the cloud formation taking place. Okay, so definitely, what evidence in the photograph indicates that A experienced high evaporation rates? We can mention it. I just want to write it there. The cloud cover. Now, if you look at question 2.4.3, love this question because this is a trick question. Why does B experience more frequent rainfall than A? Now, they've mentioned that B experienced more rainfall than A. But now the big question over here, grade 12s. A, we've just seen it, is the rural areas. We experience more cloud cover. Now, but how is it possible for it to rain more in area B if there's less cloud cover? So that's a trick question over here. We just answer that, because there's more trees, there's more vegetation, there's more open water surfaces. Okay, so how come it rains more at B? Okay, the simple reason, I'm going to show you a diagram. Quickly going to try and draw it there on the bottom of my sheet. Now, let's assume we have our urban areas. That's our CBD. Okay. And there's our rural area. Okay, just with a couple of trees. Now, we already established that we experience warmer temperatures. I just want to go back to my diagram and implicate it over here. So we got a temperature of 32 degrees Celsius over our CBD and a temperature of 22 degrees Celsius over our rural areas. Now, we just seen that there's more cloud cover being experienced in our rural areas. Okay. Now, the reason why it rains more in our urban areas is because there's more condensation nuclei. Being experienced in our urban area. And the simple reason, because it's cooler temperatures as we experience here and warmer temperatures over here, the air tends to get sucked in by the surrounding rural areas, bringing in this moist air towards the CBD. And eventually there's more condensation nuclei. What happens? The air rises, it cools, condenses clouds, and we have the possibility of rainfall. And that's the reason we experience more rainfall in our CBDs than in our rural areas. Okay. Now, if you quickly have a look at question 2.4.4, explain how the geometric shape of the buildings in the city causes greater absorption of heat. Okay. Geometric shapes is the shapes of the buildings, because what do they do? I want to write down there in the bottom. Some of these buildings reflects because of glass, and some of them absorbs because of concrete. So these geometric shapes, all these buildings from all angles, what do? They create more heat. Okay. So because of the reflection of glass and absorption of concrete, it creates an artificial surface that creates warmer temperatures. Okay. Okay, so that's the reason for the geometric shapes that creates absorption of heat because of the type of surfaces. Just imagine yourself with a tar road surface. Okay, it's dark in color, right? It absorbs much of the heat. Okay, now if you think of pavement, once again, perfect example between our rural areas and our urban areas. Think of the rugby field at school. Okay, if you're going to spend break at school, where are you going to spend it? On the rugby field, or are you going to spend it in the assembly quad that's covered with pavement? Okay, the temperatures are going to be much higher in the assembly quad because it's covered with an artificial surface, such as concrete, pavement, comparison to the rugby field that's covered with grass that's going to experience much cooler temperatures. Okay, nice experience. When you go back to school, go and measure the temperature differences between the rugby field and the assembly quad, and you will immediately see, because of the artificial surface, it creates warmer temperatures than the rugby field. Okay. Now, if we quickly have a look at 2.4.5, in that paragraph, approximately 8 lines, discuss how artificial surfaces and urban activities. Okay, so they want to know two things. And urban activities contribute to the higher temperature recordings in B. Now, I've basically answered 2.4.5 for you over here. So I'm going to mention to you. The artificial surfaces, what did we say? Okay, what does the artificial surfaces do? They absorb. Okay, it's fake. It's not real. For instance, the assembly quad, I just mentioned it to you. Okay, so it doesn't reflect the heat, it absorbs the heat, creating warmer conditions. Okay, so that leads to a rise in temperature. Now, it might be because of glass that reflects it, that creates warmer temperatures. It might be because it's dark surfaces that absorbs heat. So that leads to an increase of temperature. Now, the second question that they've asked, the urban activities. Now, I will write them down. When we look at urban activities, now in comparison, sorry, I just want to go back to our figure, diagrams. A, there's one main activity taking place, mainly a primary activity. But if you look at B, there's secondary and tertiary activities. So I'm going to write them down. You know, in our rural areas, we mainly focus on primary activities. And if you look at primary activities, it's farming, fishing, forestry, and mining. And if you look at our urban areas, that's correct, we focus on secondary and tertiary. Okay, now when we think of secondary activities, we think of light industries. We think of heavy industries. And tertiary is services. Okay. Now, light industries can be textile industries. Okay, heavy industries might be like Eskom, generating of electricity. Okay, services, think of people, congestion. Now, if we look at the question, I gave you a good breakdown, just the differences. Now, if you look at the question, the urban activities, how they contribute. Now, if you think of the rural areas, the farming doesn't contribute that much to increase of temperature because it's focused on one main activity. Now, if you look at light industries, it might be textiles, it might be bakeries, it might be car assemblies, mechanics, okay. Heavy industries that we find, generating of electricity, okay, coal burning power stations, for example, that creates pollution, okay. That pollution creates an increase in temperature. And if you think of tertiary activities, it's the services that people do. Okay, what do? They drive their cars around. Think of buses. Okay, so all of these human activities contribute to an increase of temperature because we use electricity, right? And when we use electricity, we increase temperature. Now, so that's the correct answer for that question, but I want to focus because you might as well get the next question. What can we do to counter urban heat islands? What can we do to reduce the higher temperatures in our urban areas? That's quite a vitally important question because they tend to love to ask this question. So what can we do? Let me just clean this up a little bit. What can we do to reduce, sorry, you probably can't see it at home. What can we do to reduce this 32 degrees Celsius temperatures? Now, always think economically, socially, environmentally. Okay, vitally important. I mean, we need to be sustainable. We need to preserve, right? We need to create a healthier environment. Now, to be able to reduce that urban heat island effect, what can we do? First of all, plant more plants, okay? Create green belts in our urban areas, like parks and recreation, okay? Especially start inner city farming, for example. Great idea, okay? Another very successful one is public transport. Now, unfortunately, I don't want us to concentrate on taxis like we do in South Africa. We need to think bigger, okay? When I say bigger, we need to reduce congestion, okay? When I say instead of having taxis, have buses, okay? How many people can fit on a taxi and how many people can fit on a bus? Much more. So immediately, instead of running taxis, we're running buses. So we reduce the amount of cars on the road, okay? Now, many European countries focusing on cycling lanes, okay? Greener, much more effective, okay? Not even it's going to be a much better, healthy lifestyle for yourself, but it's going to create no emissions, okay? So immediately can we reduce the carbon dioxide footprint in our city areas. Now, cities like Los Angeles, for instance, covered their tar road surfaces. They painted them white, for example, because the white reflects the heat instead of absorbing it. They deforestate taking place, create more open water surfaces, and like I said, reduce congestion. Okay, use public transport, bicycling lanes, anything in that mode. Okay, so that is solutions how we can counter the urban heat island effect. Okay, so we can create a much healthier living lifestyle. Okay.